Okay, we're ready to begin. Okay, I'm going to give a little introduction to Xin Wei, who's our candidate for a joint computer science design media arts position, which would be the first such position on this campus, actually. And I'm happy to see the chair of computer science, Milish Ertugo, is here. Thank you for coming. My introduction will be a little longer because it actually will help you track the number of works that Xin Wei is going to present to us today. He's had a considerable professional experience before he got his PhD in Stanford. So on his CV, it looks as if he's a kind of a recent graduate, but actually he's been quite busy since 1985. He was a member of the first generation of developers for the Apple Lisa and Macintosh computers, headed a team of programmers who produced the first physics simulations and microworlds for the graphical personal computer. As part of Stanford's course Authoring Tools project, Sha wrote the first generation of object-oriented mathematics and simulation software libraries that function in a general-purpose authoring environment. Along with a few colleagues, Sha provided design desiderata for a third-generation personal computer to the team of developers that Steve Jobs later took with him to start the Next Corporation, which developed the most sophisticated 680,000 computer and object-oriented operating system. He later served as a liaison between Stanford and the Next Internal Development Group and functioned as a scientific liaison between Stanford and a number of experimental firms. A couple of years before the introduction of the World Wide Web, Sha designed a network-based multimedia authoring and management tool called the Media Weaver, which allowed multimedia authors to edit, annotate, and compose media on multiple operating systems and networks. After obtaining an interdisciplinary PhD at Stanford on differential geometric performance and the technologies of writing in mathematics, computer science, and history and philosophy of science, Sha joined the faculty of the School of Literature, Communication, and Culture and the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. As research faculty in the College of Computer Graphics, Visualization and Usability Center, and the LCC's New Media Center, Sha established the Topological Media Lab for the study of gesture and material from both computational and phenomenological perspectives. His research foci include wearable and gestural media, responsive media spaces, and computationally mediated urban environments. And last, I should mention that he is a co-founder of a group named Sponge, which he'll talk about, which is a network of artists and researchers interested in creating public experiments in perception and phenomenology. Welcome, Sha Wei.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Thanks very much. Okay, is this better? All right. So thanks very much, Victoria, and I'm very delighted to be here to speak to the audience from across UCLA, and I'm very delighted to speak to both members from the Computer Science Department as well as the DMA. So since I'm here today to give you a little sense of who I am and where I came from, so instead of a talk about just one project, I'm going to take liberty, since I've been graciously given a bit of time, to give you some sense of the work I've done over the last decade and a half, let's say, roughly. So it gives you also some idea of what happened before this arrow, right? Where it's ending today at the Topological Media Lab at Georgia Tech, but also like to give you some idea of some of the ideas that are antecedent to this current work, and see maybe you can come up with a narrative thread that makes sense for this. So to give you an outline, since it is a large amount of work, to give you some outline where I'm going to talk about, Of course, I'm going to be talking about both research and teaching projects. The research breaks into several chapters, one of which is, the earliest chapter is scientific simulation and visualization, work I did at Stanford, and also the Media Weaver distributed media project, which I'll discuss as well, that has to do with, well, you'll see when I get to it, has to do with a kind of a generalization of the notion of simulation. And then more recently, after the degree, I have done work at Georgia Tech involving responsive media spaces and first initial exploration into that domain. And maybe if I have time, I'll say something about speech recognition, using speech recognition technologies in an architectural setting. And then also talk a little bit about some of the classes I've been offering in our program in IDT. First chapter then. So as Victoria mentioned, I got started with machines, computation, doing very small micro worlds. So these are simulations of pieces of the universe, and to bring them down to a scale that where you could play God, throw little balls around the sun and have them move around, for example, or to do relativity on your desktop, that kind of thing. Later on, I began to just make larger and larger simulations, more and more ambitious simulations, one of which doesn't look that much graphically, but turns out to be quite interesting for theoretical reasons, was work I did with Andre Linde at Stanford. He's a cosmologist and a person who works in quantum inflationary cosmology. And I just enjoyed this kind of work very much, and hopefully you'll see why this is there. This represents the first, instead of the first 3 minutes of the universe, this represents maybe the first 3 chronons or first few seconds of the universe. The idea there was that, if you learn from, just do a little bit of physics, people all know about the Big Bang theory, right? So the world started very small, the universe started very small, and bang, became very large over time. Under that model, though, what's hard to explain are the galaxies. Where do the big lumps in the universe come from? They come from somewhere. So people at MIT, Alan Guth, and also Andre Linde at Stanford came up with these notions of where the lumps come from in the universe. And these, in his model, came from quantum fluctuations. So I did a lot of mathematical modeling behind that for Linde to do the modeling of the universe. Each one of these little dots is a whole universe. So that's the idea. So this is not a picture of one universe, but a picture of metaverses. Okay. So I just have to go really fast, so I won't go into more there. Another area is in differential geometry. So my studies included studies of what are called minimal surfaces or constant mean curvature surfaces. These are like soap bubbles. You can dip your wire into a soap solution, pull it out, blow it, see what shapes you get. So it actually turns out that there are some techniques you can use to understand them mathematically, meaning theoretically, but there are also techniques we can use where you can use computers and visualization tools. So I spent a fair amount of time working with different kinds of systems, symbolic computation systems, like symbolic algebra systems, as well as to do, quote, exact or algebraic computation, as well as techniques for visualizing them using numerical techniques and graphical techniques. So that represents another chapter of work. Let's see. The reason why this is interesting, the graphics will get better in the course of the evening. This is all very old stuff. Is because this is an example of rotation in 4 dimensions. It's actually a surface which exists in 4-dimensional space, and we are doing a rotation, a complex rotation. So you can think of here. So here's a 2-dimensional surface. A rotation means this, right? Or like this. These are rotations in 3-dimensional space of a 2-dimensional object. So it turns out that we can make, for certain cases, we can actually take a 2-dimensional surface, sitting in 4 dimensions, or a 3-dimensional surface sitting in 4 dimensions, and rotate that in 4 dimensions. Okay, so it's actually quite easy to do it analytically, but it's very hard to visualize it. So, because you can see what happened was I turned into a waist, into a neck, and then turned into a coil again. This is something you would never be able to see if you're just looking at the equations. So that's why I was interested in visualization, coupled with analytic techniques. Okay. But the problem with all that was those techniques were very good only in special cases, when you actually had an analytic representation of the surface. You had an equation for it. Okay, so you actually rotate it. It turns out one of my questions over those years was, why is it that computers are not useful? Why is it computers are so unuseful to differential geometers trying to do creative work in mathematics? Okay? This is sometimes a surprise to people who maybe don't work in those fields of mathematics. But when I started thinking about it, at first you think, well, because computers aren't fast enough, because they're not accurate enough, or because mathematicians are poor, so we can't afford the best machines, right? This kind of stuff. But I began to think that there are more fundamental obstructions to why computers are not useful for doing creative work. I don't mean using a computer to make a picture, okay? Once you already studied some phenomena, you can go back and do graphics and make some nice picture. That would be an illustration of some object. I'm interested in creativity in the mathematical domain. I was interested in creativity in the mathematical domain. How do you actually make a conjecture about what might be true about surfaces you have not seen yet? Okay? So it's thinking of this as a creative activity. So I looked at what people do in real life. That is, what do mathematicians do in front of a blackboard? And this led to a dissertation that I did at Stanford. And the idea there was to look at everyday activities of really existing creators of geometry. Okay, not just looking at a book and making a 3D version of whatever is in the book. Okay, so I was looking at blackboards, just ordinary blackboards like this one over here, and just see what do people do. They wave their hands, you can draw, you can talk to one another, and then think about what's going on in the so-called in the heads, or maybe even better, in the bodies of the mathematicians who are doing this kind of creative conversation and making conjectures. So there are many, many interesting issues come out of that, but I won't have time to deal with it in this talk. And so just let me show you the summary video of a project I did with a student of Terry Winograd, François Gombourdier, and also with a group of researchers at Stanford in the Computer Science Department, Pat Hanrahan's graphics group and Terry Winograd's HCI group. That means HCI meaning Human-Computer Interaction Group. In that group, I'll give you a little bit more preface. That group was quite interesting in that they were basically trying to look at new kinds of interfaces, throw away the mouse, keyboard, screen, and just retain the idea of a large flat surface, the size of that blackboard, which is automatically shared because it's big. It's too big for any one person to reach around. It's high resolution. It has the same resolution as your screen, and it has an architecture which allows you to map in all sorts of devices. It could be portable keyboards, it could be PDAs, it could be pens and stylus. It could be gesture with a hand, with a camera from behind the screen tracking their hands. You can use your bare hands to actually manipulate stuff on the board. Also, the board was a tabula rasa. It's basically an architecture which had no, how do you say, very few requirements. There's no notion of a window, for example, finally. No notion of a window on that architecture. And it also had a very rich set of layers in architecture to allow you to, for example, do gesture recognition with your own custom recognizers. Okay. So what it meant to me was that finally I had access to a technology which was really like a blackboard, but with all the computer behind the blackboard. The blackboard would be something on which you can draw freely. Okay. So I was able to, thanks to support by this group. Oh, I should never go back. So let me start again, so I can play the video for you from scratch. With the support of this group, I was able to make this thing sound. Let it play.
Currently, when a mathematician works on a whiteboard, she or he employs a mixture of sketches, diagrams, formulas, and fragments of ordinary language. The mathematician moves easily from mode to mode, drawing a figure in one region of the board and doing related algebraic or analytic calculations in another. On the other hand, when the mathematician wishes to employ computer tools like a symbolic algebra system, he needs to write code in a different syntax and work across multiple modes that are separated more formally. In this video, we present a new front-end to Mathematica using the Stanford Interactive Mural, which is a large, high-resolution display. In our design, we try to retain as much as possible the casual ease and flexibility of using a blackboard, while augmenting it with dynamic 3D graphics and with the features of a symbolic algebra engine. For our prototype, the Geometers Workbench, we focus on graphical interaction rather than formulas and text, and would choose to work with specific types of geometry. Here's a typical example of a graphical idiom employed by a geometer working on the whiteboard. There is a domain space, in this case the plane R2, a target or range space, in this case three-dimensional Euclidean space R3, and a function f that maps from the domain R2 to the range R3. This inspired us to dedicate 3 regions on the mural in an analogous manner. There's a region on the left for the domain space R2, a region in the middle where the user graphically selects a mapping from R2 to R3 from a 2-parameter family of mappings, and a region on the right for the range space R3. Here the user selects a family of minimal surfaces to be studied from a menu. He can explore this 2-parameter family of mappings by tapping at various points in the region. The mathematician can also explore the space of mappings by drawing a continuous stroke, which is resampled by the workbench. The vertical parameter determines how much of the surface is to be included. The horizontal parameter selects a member of a continuous family of minimal surfaces. This approach to exploring a family of mappings was inspired by the method of small multiples. Seeing all the multiples at once, the user can remember where he's been and compare past discoveries. When he is satisfied, he can select a particular mapping using the flow menu. In the left-hand region, the user can draw freehand strokes or use the flow menu to select from a library of predefined shapes, like circle, square, or triangle. These shapes are useful, for example, in gauging the curvature of the surface. The right-hand region shows the image of the shape under the selected mapping. In particular, it shows the images under the mapping of objects drawn in the left-hand domain, as computed by Mathematica. We can see, for example, how the triangle has been deformed first under mapping to a sphere and then to a concavely curved triangle under mapping to a saddle surface. We carefully designed our system to allow casual exploration of the geometry of the mappings. In our experience with the Geometers Workbench, we discovered that users required very few predefined objects. Here, to discover the orientation of the surface, the user invents a tool by drawing an asymmetric L shape. To define and debug an orientation detector in Mathematica or C would have taken far more effort on the part of the user. As the user changes the parameters of the mapping, the workbench updates the display to reflect these changes. If we change the family, then the workbench will compute new small multiples with the same parameter values as before, and also update the image by projecting the objects in the domain under the new mapping. Despite the latency introduced by Mathematica, the user is still able to continue his work as the system updates asynchronously. We took great pains to design for latency in the Geometers Workbench. We believe that no matter how fast our architecture becomes, people will always use the system near the limit of its performance envelope, so it is important not to dismiss the latency issue. In our case, we took advantage of the spacious, high-resolution surface at our disposal to trade between multiplexing in time using sliders and multiplexing in space using the small multiples approach. We have presented a large, high-resolution, blackboard-like display with 3D graphics on which collaborating geometers can explore mappings and surfaces that are generated by a symbolic algebra engine. The Geometers Workbench makes it possible to steer symbolic computation using purely graphical interaction, and also, using small multiples and decoupling, allows the user to continue working despite the inevitable latencies caused by the symbolic computation of geometrically interesting surfaces.
Now it's being recorded. I can say something different. But for the record, I'd like to credit Francois Berthier and a student Terry Wondergrad who did this work with the graphics engines. But some points I'd like you to just carry on into the rest of the lecture, even though this is very specific to mathematics and geometry and computer science, I'm interested in writing systems where writing is construed much more broadly than with, let's say, alphabetic text. And so that actually carries on into other domains as well. I know some scholars here have written extensively about this kind of issue from a theoretical point of view. I'm quite interested in that as well. So another issue is the issue of computed response. That is, you make a gesture, the person makes a gesture, and we have now a machine, a computer making a response to the gesture, where the response can be very, very rich. In this case, it's done with computer algebra systems. But in other applications, as you will see later on tonight, the response could be in the form of music or in the form of visuals that can be projected onto the floor. Okay? Some issues actually come up and are uncommon. But before I move on to that kind of work, I want to describe another chapter of my work at Stanford, which is, this is out of order, all right, you will see if you look at the dates. But I want to congregate or aggregate all the scientific work together, the scientific applications together, and then talk about this media application in this section here. This is a project that I was the architect of called the Media Weaver project. The problem is this one, okay? This is after about, again, I'd say, about 5 years, 6 years of work working with very rich forms of simulation. Now, not physics simulations, but more general kinds of simulations, like games or social science simulations, where instead of particles or planets, you have people, people are much more complicated than with electrons or pebbles, right? So we were working in teams. I had people working in teams with graphic artists, with script writers, with economists who are writing various kinds of economic models for social science simulations, people working with art collections of art, for example, and who want to be able to so-called repurpose the media in other kinds of simulations across heterogeneous environments. So these were some of the big problems that people were facing at that time. This was just before the web, so I would say this is around 1991, something like this. Okay. So, but already there were these questions of rich media of arbitrary type. For example, at that point, we already had the beginnings of digital video in some fairly standard formats, but MPEG was just getting off the ground. So we knew ahead of time that the formats for encoding these kinds of media would change in the future. Instead of going through the standards race, which we did actually, another approach is to abstract, is to go to an object-oriented model in which there are abstractions of, let's say, the movie by Hitchcock, the movie X frame Z of Hitchcock, and not at the same time bind to a particular file. Okay, so there's decoupling that was necessary. Another reason for doing that is that this kind of social science simulations often involve relational models. So, for example, if you want to do a model of political, the censorship, let's say, the censorship structures in France in 17th century, 15th to 17th century, that related to how different writers would work against or with the censorship structures, and in turn with the structures of, let's say, relations between the church and the king. These were very, very complex relational models, which could be modeled by a relational database, yes, but they had to be changed all the time because people would change their minds about how those power structures work, which meant that these different kinds of relational models needed to be built in a very flexible way. Other practical things were these issues I had to work on networks, which included Unix machines, Macintoshes, PCs, et cetera, et cetera. So these are engineering questions which came up. All right. So, but the main point was that we needed some sort of framework to accommodate all that. So again, you must remember this is just before the web. Okay. So the Media Weaver system was a system in which I don't have time to show you videos, even though videos are even interesting even today, not just for historical reasons, because there are things that we could do that you cannot do now, which is true for all sorts of research work, right? But to give you a flavor of what we were doing at that point, this is the next step front end, which I wrote on top of the system, which allows you to, in which you have a field here that can run rich text, like Microsoft Word, right? But when the object coming in is of sound type, it will just reformat itself appropriately, or cast basically appropriately to the appropriate type of view, allow you to, in this case, select pieces of sound, which you could actually then use in turn as an object you could actually write into another document. So for example, here, you'll see later on, You could, if you were to speak into it, and then your voice comes out as could come out as an icon which appears in the view, or could be used as a target by which you could send to a query engine, to a database. Up, down. Thanks. Great. Okay, great. So sound less like a Borg. That'd be great. So this is in one sentence a description of the system. I won't spend too much more time describing that part, that's interesting in the applications. So, for example, one interesting conceptual issue with this was that this allowed us to deal with files and streams uniformly. What that means is that we could do a search and find a video as a file. We could find a score file. We can find an executable, for example. But we could also find a channel. So you can actually just put in all your streams if you want to, and just go searching on streams as well. Or you can go to live video, and that's when you can actually go and look for channel 7, or look at what we now know is like weather channels or webcams, et cetera, et cetera. The system is able to treat all that homogeneously: executables, files, streams, et cetera. Okay, and you could use any object to annotate any other object. Any object. In terms of authoring, so it's not just database stuff. Here, for example, this shows you that we wanted to be able to find, again, new forms of writing. Yes, in this case, we had an agents model, which had a temporal database, meaning properties of people pertaining only to a particular time. So let's say this person had a lifetime between 1948 and 2001, and in that period of time, these are all fake, of course, right? Foucault never lived here. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. You could actually set new properties by dragging these characters around, and then the properties would be updated according to this kind of graphical interface. Okay, just to give you some idea of the flavor of the variety of kinds of interfaces you could use. Here, for example, is another one. This is a Macintosh client where you had access to the same agents database, but here are some of the researchers who were in that project, and they would be speaking with each other through the live video feed on top of this. Now remember, this is all before the web. After the web came out, things became much harder. So we did 14 projects in 3 years with 6 universities, starting with Stanford, MIT, and then Berkeley and some other schools. Okay, to give you some idea of the kinds of applications we were able to build with very small resources based on this flexible architecture. 2 in detail. One was an archive of an art database. In this case, art related to Renaissance theater, which was done with Bill Edelman at Stanford in the drama department, and Judy Dolan, who now teaches at UCSD in the theater department down there. So in this case, we could pull objects off from the network, and we examine them by bringing them into focus, and then pops up with all its related documents. Okay, this kind of thing. This interface, very primitive interface, but also very flexible interface, could be put together in minutes. Okay, this was not like the web at all, even with XML, PHP stuff. That little microphone on the right-hand side, if you wanted to annotate with voice, just speak into it, and annotations would come up related to this document. Or, no, not related to this object here. Okay. Another extension of the system, I directed a PhD dissertation, James Wang, who was in the computer science department at that time. And in that case, we were able to, because of the flexibility of the architecture, I'm sorry, I don't want to take the time to go into too much detail about the architecture, but because of all these layers of abstraction, the architecture allowed us to send queries to arbitrary types of search engines. So not just text-based search engines, but also to search engines based on more experimental techniques like sound or wavelets. In this case, I had this idea of using wavelets as a rapid way to search for images in a collection of images. Because at that time, this is now some time ago, the techniques then were based on, let's say, formal representations, like what color is the image, or does the image what size the image is, or if you put it into blocks, what color is the upper right-hand corner, all those techniques, okay? Whereas with wavelets, I was thinking, well, wavelet data is very interesting, because if any of you know something about sound is periodic. So, and the usual techniques for dealing with sound may not work very well for images because an image is not necessarily periodic, right? So an image may have flowers on the right-hand corner, but no other flowers in the rest of the image, right? Not all images, very few images are really periodic, the way that sound is periodic, which means that the standard technique for doing analysis of sound by digital signal analysis would not necessarily work so well for images. So that's why I thought wavelets would be very powerful. And in fact, it turned out to be very good. It turned out to be the best method, at least for a few years, for doing that kind of image search. So you could draw a picture. You could draw, here, I'll show you. Okay, standard database would be a set of images which don't really look like one another. Okay, it's kind of a scatter. These are very small sets, of course. And then the idea is that you could actually take a given image as a target, like this, and present it to the system. Find me all the pictures in the database that look like boats, or have stuff that looks like boats come up. It actually works. It's actually quite fun. I'll show you the next slide. Another way was that you might want to draw. So let's say here. No, it's too easy. Here, okay, mountain. So what you could do is, James did a very good job with interface too at the end. You could draw like a triangle, or in the previous frame, remember we saw a red fish, you could draw a fish. It would try to find, this is not art, right? This is querying by images. You could present such a target to the system, so do the wavelet decomposition, go through the database and find out all the images that have fish-like shapes in it, anywhere. So here's an example. So this was the target image, I presume, and then found out through that previous database. Okay, you saw it was very heterogeneous. This is what it did. And there is a mistake, right? But it's okay. Actually, this is poetic. This begins to be fun, right? It's a bit like working with speech recognizers. You say something like cat, it says bat, right? It's hard of hearing. So it's that kind of thing. This began to be really fun, but look how good it is, right? Most of the dinosaurs appear. All the dinosaurs actually appear, and a few false positives. Okay. And this is just one deeper line of the Media Weaver project. Just wanted to show because I'm proud of it, this work. Okay. I'll skip these. Now we come to the present. And how am I doing here? Okay, well, 18. I better speed up a little bit. Okay. At Georgia Tech, I started a lab. I built a lab, a small lab, okay, but with hopefully some interesting work. The way that I can stratify the work is from micro to macro. In the micro scale, it's working with trying to find new forms of computational media, meaning instead of just let's say a bitmap on the screen, maybe the bitmap has some physics, so it can be elastic. You could tug on the edge of the bitmap and let go with the mouse. It might start to wiggle like jelly, right? Suppose we present this kinds of media and make them available to designers. What can designers do? So the general approach I'm taking is stuff rather than objects. So in the previous work, the media was very unsatisfactory to me because we had to work with objects, the whole image, the whole fish, the whole dinosaur. Another approach is to think about computational media here. And the basic questions for me are gesture and tangibility, or gesture and materiality. So how can we use our gestures, we see the connection with previous work, right? And have that as a basic form of interaction with the machine. And then how can the machine generate, let's say, provide some sort of tangibility to its computed media? Now, the computed media is not just computed, it can also be physical materials. So it could be also pieces of fabric or walls, etc. Okay, which is why the macro scale, I'm interested in applying, ultimately, everting these technologies and putting them to everyday settings, like a park or a bus stop or a train station or an airport. Okay, the kind of work I'm doing, I think, seems to be reflect very well some of the ways that people are thinking about doing work here at UCLA. So I'll just put up this kind of slide, this kind of loop going on. The idea is that we're trying to do thick experiments where it's not just done in a laboratory with laboratory conditions, but we're trying to do work where we take what anthropologists call thick experiences or thick descriptions. In this case, it's actually a whole environment like a dinner, or which I hope we'll have a nice dinner here. Okay, a dinner or a performance, a dance, a conversation with friends, right? Instead of just looking at one aspect of that experience, maybe one aspect would be something like what colors are being projected onto the floor. We actually look at the whole experience. And then try to understand what some problems might occur if we try to actually augment such spaces with computation. And those will provide some interesting areas because we can work in computer science in any direction. We can try to find a better compression algorithm for this kind of media, or we can try to find better network solutions. But what's interesting would be to find heuristics for what's worth pursuing. Okay, that's what I mean by finding critical heuristics. In the other direction, the results from computer science. Now, not everything is useful for theater, let's say. Not everything is useful for music. So what we're trying to do is have a little more reflective way to use to bundle together the results of such experiments, research, and put them together into different kinds of settings. Here are some projects I've worked. Sort of looking at the clock, I will only be able to speak about the first one, the TGarden spaces. Okay, but I'll try to do that now in more detail. I'll come back to this. This is a heads up, basically a look toward current work I'm pursuing at Georgia Tech, and I'll make sure I come back to this. All right. Let me get to the TGarden system. Now, this is a slide which is not about computer science. It's about why I'm pursuing this work from a phenomenological point of view. This means I'm interested in building rich spaces with my colleagues, other artists, in building rich spaces which can be experienced as play, spaces of play, not office, not the home for making a kitchen, for example, and not for so-called cognition. It's for play. Okay. And the other question that we're thinking about is this notion of the consolation that's afforded by the activity of dissolving bodies into a field and reforming bodies out of the field. This is you can say it's metaphorical, but you can think very concretely of a garden. You're pouring water over, put some seeds in the soil. You can wait for the sprouts to grow, et cetera, et cetera. You can be a gardener or a farmer, okay, the same thing. That's one reason we call this TGarden. Some research questions. Okay, that was a little bit of a theatrical way of putting the motivation for TGarden. Here are some of the questions that we're trying to answer in the terms of research. How is it that people can improvise gestures alone or together, collectively? Improvise is very important for me here. I'm not looking at standard gestures like, hello, goodbye, or click here, click there, that kind of thing. I'm interested in providing people a rich, continuous space, and you'll see a video pretty soon now. Another question is, how do people coordinate activities without resorting to language? Because a lot of this talk in social science is about tacit knowledge. The idea that you know how to do things, you know how to ride a bicycle, you know how to play a violin, but it might be very hard for you to explicitly articulate how you do that. So with computer interfaces becoming more and more complicated, I'm interested in trying to find other ways for people to work with such let's say, environments without actually reading a user manual. So I think what I will do is show you this video. Two videos of work that we did that was exhibited in Siglath, Greece, Holland, and most recently Holland and Austria. Here. Sound. This is the very first version that we did. So we're now 3 versions beyond that. We ask people to move in this space. They're wearing sensors in the body, and we say, you are now putting on new bodies, and you're also now putting on new voice. Listen to what you're doing. So as people move around, they revert, in this case, for example, to a very autistic form of behavior. They're very timid. They might break something. Then they realize, well, they're not going to break the room. It's okay. So they begin to play with the room to try to become more expansive with emotion, and they begin to play with one another. So since I want to go a little bit further. Here's an example of somebody playing in the room, and see, in a minute. What's happening here is that, what do they see in the room? These are rich videos, doesn't seem rich on this thing, which are basically videos of natural processes, like in this case, bark peeling, or coagulation, or boiling water, these kinds of natural processes, and which we project onto the floor around the people. This provides a kind of a visual topography for people so they can actually navigate in the space. Now, we're deliberately using video of natural processes because we want to provide as much density as possible for people. Remember I was talking about dense, thick experience. So we're trying to present what is artistically a very rich environment, dense environment, so that people can actually work with this kind of density. The challenge is to make that dense environment responsive. To give you some idea, this is now the second version, done a year later, of the kind of setting we're putting it in. I just want to show this kind of video shows you the structures. It's a small space for about 5 people, up to 5 people. And we commissioned artists, fabric artists, to make different costumes. These costumes all have a purpose to them, in addition to being very fun and fancy. So this slinky costume gives you a lot more elasticity. Your body is much more elastic than it used to be. Okay. This is the Michelin Man. So the Michelin Man, the idea is the body is much bigger, but it weighs about the same. So you haven't changed the weight, but just much bigger now. And this guy is a dancer. He came from the UK to try this out. We put eye packs on the body because eye packs running very fine. It'll do about 11 beats. We put accelerometers on the arm and on the chest, and that's where we're getting the gestures. And we actually go through a ritual of dancing because it's very important for people to enter the space in the form of ritual, in the form of theater, so that they come into the space like a sacred space, talking about sacred spaces. And that way they feel like they are now really able to invent gestures. Okay? So let me go forward. The room comes in many, many, many different climates. So each climate is associated with a different kind of cantus firmus, or basso continuo, this idea of a kind of a sound which is always running underneath your feet. Each body comes with a sound. Look at her, what she's doing. She's moving like this. That swishing sound, and the squeak. She doesn't know it yet, but she did that. And then she smiles 2 beats later. There, she's starting to smile. And then she comes back and says, how did I do this? Then she starts to improvise. She starts with, what, did I do it this way? Did I do it this way? How did it work? It's not trigger. There is no trigger. There's no one gesture that will do this. Everything's running in continuous time. So it's more like an accumulation of energy, accumulation of tension that begins to start cascading kind of sound. Okay? It's very crucial. I'm interested in continuous time system because that's part of the density of life. And this is what I mean by learning. This is a different kind of learning where people are actually learning without speaking, learning without stopping to reflect upon the object that they're learning about. This case is the system that they're learning. So she's learning to move now. She has a new body. So you see what's very important also is that this kind of learning is coupled directly with the corporeal and the physical. So that's why we're building these costumes at the same time that we're building the software, so that we can actually combine together these into what I call wearable instruments. This is the view from above. We're doing open graphics on the floor, where again, this is primitive graphics, of course, but the point is not so much the textures yet. We'll see that in another video coming up, but more the idea that these are wings. When people walk into the space, they're wings, and the wings detach and reattach because of tracking errors. It's very important. I'm interested in working with errors as part of the system, because I want to use the glitch as part of the experience of the space. When the tracking system loses track of the people, their wings detach, and they go to another body. So then they begin into a kind of a natural game. So this makes the space actually much more playful when the wings detach and reattach. So that's part of the playfulness of the space. Give you some idea of the resources that were pulled together to make that happen. Now, at Georgia Tech, this was done at public venues like Ars Electronica, B2 Rotterdam, SIGGRAPH, and Mediatheta in Athens, Greece. What I've done is to basically take it apart and move it back home to Georgia Tech. And there we're working on various elements of the system to try to make something better for theatrical purposes, for performance purposes. So for example, gesture tracking. I'm working on different kinds of statistical techniques to actually make much richer ways of actually tracking the people's motions. I'm working on what we built already before is a way to model the physics of this room. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Okay. Give you a map here. This looks like a very technical thing, but also is simultaneously a metaphorical graph. Because if you look carefully at the names, this is how we talked about the theater of this place as designers of the interaction of the space. We said at some point the room may be sensitive, at some other time the room may be very turbulent, at some other time the room may be very passive or may be very alert. Okay? This is the language we use. It's a poetical, metaphorical language, one might say. But instead, of just leading at the level of metaphor, we're able to actually make this room evolve itself in response to sensor data from state to state in a continuous way. So the room itself would begin to fade out if people were behaving in a certain way. Okay? To give you some idea. And then there were also topologies for the people themselves. So for example, if I first walk across the floor, the idea was that I'm leaving behind a scratch in the floor. So this is metaphorical talk. I'm making an incision into the membrane of the floor. This is the way that we were talking about this kind of experience. We're designing this kind of experience. So as I leave the incision, the floor unpeels behind my feet. And underneath, I'm exposing huge lava-like domain. This kind of magma, kind of a magma of activities underneath my feet. And then later on, this form of writing as cutting on the body of the room becomes transformed to another form of incision onto the room. So that means we are going from, let's say, from surface writing to depth writing, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have time to go into the theatrical metaphors we were doing, but this is kind of a language for not scripting the behavior of the people, but for describing the physics, or let's say the theatrical physics of a space. I will skip this. There's a paper I'm preparing. Okay, there's a paper I'm preparing regarding this in more detail, which I can provide if you're interested. May jump to this. So at Georgia Tech, this is fresh out of the oven. Let me turn up the volume. This is the birth of calligraphic video. Let's put it this way. So when it turns blue, you'll be able to see.
There's a lag. Where's the lag from?
These are layers of video composite on the floor, and what I want to do is be able to pour video on the floor and move it around like ink. Okay? So as people walk around, you see it's beginning to appear. We're generating the mask, moving the mask around, and compositing video through the mask. And that way, we can actually have the body itself be the brush. So as you walk across the floor, you're brushing video across the floor. We can composite multiple layers of video, and that's just a way to really make video itself into kind of a medium. We're beginning to move toward computational media with this technique. And let's see if I have anything more here. No? Okay, there's better stuff there. Because you see, that's a disk, which is not so interesting. But what we can do now is actually the mask itself can be also formed according to the motion from the accelerometers. So the way you tint your body itself also shapes and nuances the stroke of the brush. Okay. Now, the kind of work I'm doing now, let's see, I'll move on from there, involves really looking at the body as somehow something thick between the skin and the walls of the world, the walls of the room around you. So it's not just metaphor again, it's actually something we can begin to do using work, for example, of Sundaris and TGarden and Sunli Park at Georgia Tech, but there are other people, of course, there are also researchers here at UCLA who are also interested in working with active fabrics. So we are collaborating with various researchers and designers and artists and my own students here in actually working with creating these kinds of active garments. I said before that I want to think of these as playful spaces. So imagine what we will have. We're looking at spaces which are thickened by these kinds of active fabrics, meaning fabrics that can center motion, and fabrics which can also can make images. So one of the collaborators that's on the previous slide has techniques to allow us to address the cloth itself and change its image. So I think of all these as interesting techniques to actually thicken the body between the self and the world, so that there's a continuum between clothing, furniture, architecture. This is something that I'm exploring now. And often I'm asked by certain people, let's say from sociology or from cognitive psychology or from HCI, how do you know when this room works? How do you know that it's actually working? Well, this is not normally asked for a piece of theater or film. You write a review, right? You don't literally just go by some numerical measure. So I'm engaged in a project to understand playfulness. How can we understand the playfulness of a space and along various notions. For example, the notion of agency. How much agency do I have in such a space where the very floor itself can come to a boil behind my feet? It's not just because of my footsteps, it's because of autonomous processes which are running behind my feet. Right? So, should I go on and do this? I wonder, I'm going to do a time check. I'm now near the end of this session, but I also would like to talk a little bit about the courses I'm teaching. So if that's okay, I'd like to show you some of the work I'm doing here at Georgia Tech in terms of the graduate program. Okay? So, yeah. There are multiple versions. One of them, the simplest version, is passive fabric and putting sensors on top. You can stitch them or Velcro them in. So the sensors can be, right now we're using tiny OS modes. These are small modes. These are about this big, have little radios on them. So we can measure acceleration. We can measure sound, using the systems, we can measure sound, photocells. There's photocells, we can measure light. And there's magnetometers, we can measure how close we are to another body. And finally, there's one more. We can actually attach all sorts of analog to digital analog sensors as well. Like we can actually put on also a strain to measure stretch, this kind of thing. So the next generation, we're thinking of putting on, because TGarden already has these sensors on other models, which we can use to measure temperature and conductivity of the skin. So, but for my purposes, I'm not looking at that. Questions? By TGarden stuff? Okay. I will skip all the rest of the syllabus, but just to give you some idea. I'm teaching a course this year of programming paradigms for designers, and I've been speaking with some of the professors here about this. I'm also talking about coming up with a course which is appropriate for designers. Yes? Please.
I'm not working in this, but working nanotechnology. So if you take something, like a painting process, okay, in the past, they solid state physicists were doing would say, lead the research in the field, and then people who were making the device would make the device. Now we have a situation where the technology, say a painting process, is a way ahead. Any of the research laboratories would say, right, the research on, a painting process. So if I think that, like modern movies that were made today, like Lord of the Rings, where they had Gollum or something, and they have a person with all these multiple sensors, and they have all the money and the software. I'm asking, is there some relationship between the way that technology is going in, that it's in a realm, commercial realm, where the artists, like the scientists, can no longer compete alone. I see you're looking at relationships between people and so on. They don't maybe look at this point where the technology that they have is probably ahead of your technology. So is there a future for artists to work in these systems? If they don't, if it's state of the art in Hollywood.
Okay. Okay. All right. I was at Banff, Canada, for this conference. Actually, Victoria's there too. And the purpose of that conference is exactly this kind of question, talking about how do artists work together with scientists? How could artists and scientists work together to produce, in this case, pieces of culture, like cultural artifacts? And actually, I don't know if the technology is ahead. See, it's not just a machine; it's actually the purpose. Why do we want to build this kind of technology versus something else? We could, like I said earlier, we could spend more time building compression techniques, right, for compressed video, or we could spend more time and money and expertise building fabrics, which have some meaning to people on the body, right? And they all take resources from institutions, and that's what I mean by heuristics. I think the heuristics can come from cultural, not just artists, but cultural norms, not just artistic norms. So I see art as part of that. So in other words, what do I see? I mean, I think this is a way to get something very powerful experience. How do we make powerful experiences possible? The good sponge I started, that Victoria mentioned, was started by myself and 2 people from theater. And the question that my colleagues posed to me was, how is it in the 20th century, well, 21st century, how can we create experiences, or have people, us, create our own experiences that are as powerful as experiences that were made possible by Brecht, works of Brecht, Heine Miller, Bob Wilson, Pina Bausch, these kinds of experiences, yes? As powerful as that. But they were forms that you can say, but they were forms which are historically limited to those periods. They were good for people in Germany in 1930, let's say, but they don't work, they don't move us today as they did for those participants then. That's the question. So part 2 is, how can we do that without appealing to narrative structure? Without appealing to a character, or appealing to this idea of classical notion or scintillant notion of plot, that kind of stuff. It's a big challenge. So I'm interested in working at that level. That's why I say phenomenology, not art, not computer science, but phenomenology. What is it like to actually have an experience which is compelling? Okay. So from this perspective, we can talk about things like agency, tangibility, materiality, and then we can talk about issues of like designing for the urban structure or designing for things that we put on the body. So it's from a different angle. See, it's neither straight, just doing computer science, and neither just doing pieces of, artifacts you put in the cage somewhere. So that's the beginning of the conversation, but maybe I better continue then, okay? Yes?
You said something about how do we know that it works? And I was trying to understand that in the concept of the combination of art and science that you have. If it was pure science, then if you repeat the same sequence of motions, you should get the same effect. And if it was art, you should never have that kind of repeatability. So I don't know what, or I suppose having that kind of repeatability is not necessary condition to show that it works. So how do you determine whether it's working?
So this is, yes.
In pure science, if you move and develop what's mechanical, you don't get the same result.
That's true. Yes, actually.
In a control experiment, you should get the same result every time. Otherwise, all the factors are not the same.
This is actually an interesting remark, and it would take a longer time. We should talk about this over dinner, because this question of observability and repeatability is a deep issue. Actually, I mean, we have here a scholar from, among other things, in the area of science and literary studies, Professor Hales here. And in this area, people have been talking about this notion of what constitutes evidence. How do you know that you have a scientific fact, right? This kind of question. Those seem to be, they're not just scholastic questions. What you just asked was an example of why it's not just a scholastic question. It is an important question for how is it that we can gauge the power, the experiential power of a space. I can say right now that I'm also interested in answering this question, which is why I had a slide up about playfulness, you see. I think the challenge is actually to be thrown back to people, let's say, from cognitive science and HCI. So the question is, you have methods, I count myself in that field as well. We have methods to evaluate whether or not an interface works when you have a task, like sending an email, okay? But that's because, that's in a sense the easy problem, because we know what the tasks are ahead of time. What's really hard is play. If you look at kids play, I have a 12-year-old, and if you look at, I have a student of mine who's working with kids from 5 to 12, and we're looking at kids, and their tasks change all the time. In fact, the game is making the tasks, you see. It's a meta problem. So, but you see, we don't start from zero. The ideas that we can draw upon come from theater, from music, from dance. It's not going to come from the standard techniques for evaluating a task-oriented interface. Okay, this is a long discussion, which I will continue, but I just give you the tip. Okay, that's the tip of the answer to that. We know how to make, it is known how to make powerful theater. Okay, the research I'm engaging is how to make new kinds of powerful theater, where theater is not just what you see on stage. Actually, right here, this is theater, right? Each time you teach, it's a theater. And when kids play on the floor in the industry, it's theater. It's that kind of notion.
Whether repeatability is desirable or not. It sounds to me it's not, is what you're saying.
Well, we should talk about this because repetition is a very complicated question. Very complicated question. Okay, repetition makes sense when looking at a 10 millisecond range, let's say, or maybe, but at 1 second range or more, it doesn't make sense anymore because every time I take a stroke with the violin, okay, if you play violin, all right, you can make matilde, hammer stroke. Okay, it's not that they're identically repeated. It's that, I mean, it says repeat. Okay, it says hammer. You know, take the violin and make it bounce on the string. But if you read, like in the Grove Dictionary of Music, how do you play matilde stroke? It says every time you bow up, you have to bow up a little bit faster than when you bow down. It's not really repeated. So repeatability is a very, very, very complicated question. Okay, and I'm studying that kind of thing in terms of temporal texture. Okay, but what I'm saying is that there's a lot that's known about how this works, which is why I'm working with musicians, because musicians who are working with gesture-controlled electronic music, instruments, have a deep knowledge of how to actually build systems that work in this way, and they have repeatable response. They have repeatable. This is work at Karma, Stanford, IRCAM in Paris, Stein in Amsterdam. Okay, so there are actually centers for work that we're collaborating with there, and Sony labs in Paris. Okay. Maybe I should. What do you say? I should skip these two. Okay, these are some of the courses involved. Last frame, give you some idea. Now that it begins to get interesting, I'm sorry I spent so much time on the technical part, but I want to just show some of the prior work here. But give you a heads up in this frame here. In my current work and future work, what I want to pursue, what I'm pursuing now, are at the scientific level, let's say, work on gesture tracking. Okay. Work on what it means to do continuous media choreography. It's not the same as putting a video on the floor and then play another video and then play another video. It's as I walk across the floor, as I walk down the corridor in a room, I want to have my visual environment changing continuously in time. Okay, like Bill Viola, right? This piece where you walk down, the famous piece, you walk down the corridor and the tree blossoms. You walk back, the tree fades down. Very simple, but very beautiful. It's poetic work, right? But very simple, also. But that's a one-off. That's one piece. It's one vision, and it works. Okay. But now, if you have a world around us, which is partly augmented in this way, you want to be able to walk across, right, and have these kind of visual environments change around us. So, wireless sensor is something that we're working on right now, as I mentioned before. In terms of design, I'm working on real-time systems. I went to Rebecca's class earlier and had good conversations with your students. So we have high technology for making special effects, right, with big iron. But now we have machines which are powerful enough so that we can actually now think about designing with real-time media systems. Okay, I can move around. So like here, walk across the floor. Okay, you hear this sound? This is done by physics. Okay, imagine now we have computation running underneath the floor, which we can do now. Okay, so this sound can be sampled and modified and turned into speech. And it can talk. The floor can talk to me as I move. I can go like this, tap shift, no, a tap, right? Like this, and it can modulate the speech. Okay, what can we do with that? So we have systems that can do this now. Finally, at the level of applications, I'm working, as I mentioned earlier, to design these wearable instruments. In the category of software, this is actually terminology from Joey Brzozowska at Concordia. So here we are looking at responsive fabrics, and also we're looking at how to design more things like the TGarden system, responsive media spaces altogether. So I should leave it at this. There are some more projects I can show, but I will leave it here. Thank you for your attention. Please. Please.
Obviously, you have a quite impressive broad background ranging from art and song and computer science and so forth. I'd like to know your work. Does it present any particular challenges to state of the? Is it on? Oh, okay. Your work, does it present any particular challenges to the state of the art in computer science, and what would they be?
Perhaps I should defer to researchers with more experience in that question, but I can venture some answer, all right, in this domain. One of the challenges in terms of the computer science that I'm facing right now is at the level of pattern recognition, or rather gesture tracking to be specific. So gesture tracking, this question I should not go like this. Gesture tracking, okay. well, two different kinds of tracking. One is an area of vision, but that's more technical, and there are engineering solutions to that. But I think a fundamental problem is the notion of gesture tracking. So because we already have, right? People already put sensors on the body. So we have more and more streams of data coming in from the body. But for me, I'm interested in minimal instrumentation. I don't want to festoon the body with the data, because I want to ultimately see these in ordinary settings, like a bracelet or like an earring or something you can put in your shoelace and things like this. And then it becomes a very interesting, to me, interesting mathematical challenge, is how can we put in a minimal amount of sensing on the body, and then how can we do just the right kinds of statistical analysis and do it in real time. This is a very severe challenge. How to do it all in real time for any generation of equipment. That gives us some notion of how people are moving. Now, I have to be very careful about this. What makes the problem simpler is that we don't need to solve an AI problem. This is not an artificial intelligence problem. It is quote, merely a digital signal analysis problem. It can be framed completely within the domain of signal analysis. So that's one, but there are many others. Yeah. Please. Questions? Give you visual feedback. I won't talk about it, just show it. See if I can run. You don't have to wait for me. Too mesmerizing. The quick version. I'm going to get back to Hubbub. There we go. Okay. Eye candy. But anyway, pay no attention to the screen behind me. So.
Just have a quick question about the use of technology in theater and performance spaces that you mentioned. It seems like historically technology seems to contribute mostly to the spectacle of performance. And do you see the work that you're doing in that same vein, or doing something different? If you're not doing Aristotelian performance, what is the contribution of technology to the performance technique or the style? Related question, sort of at the same time, is there a distinction between audience and performer in your work, and what role does that play?
Yeah, very fast. What's your name, by the way?
Jeff.
Jeff? Hi. Okay. Wonderful question. When I started Sponge, as I mentioned before, that was one of the organizing questions for us in terms of performance research, is we wanted to not have any division between performer and spectator. Okay, and that's not new. I mean, people have done this since like Pirandello talked about this kind of thing as well in Italian theater. But it is an organizing principle. It's not have any division between spectator and actor. Okay. It's also interesting from a philosophical point of view, because this brings up, from a philosophical point of view, because this is phenomenology. That is, this brings up the question of phenomenology, which is this, maybe I should not compete with myself. Should I compete with myself? Maybe I should pause. Damn, I just want to be able to show without talking about it, but it's not going to work. Different project. Which is this idea about if you take a hammer and just hammer it, if you're expert at using a hammer, this is Heidegger, right? You don't think about the hammer until it breaks. Then you notice, I have a broken hammer in my hand. Okay, so we've gone between two modes of existence. One is doing without thinking, and then suddenly thinking. Say, oh, there's a hammer, it's broken, what do I do about it? So theatrically, we're interested in Sponge. We're interested actually this kind of move between reflective and immersed forms of experience. To us, that's a very interesting form of theater. Because you see, if we don't make a distinction between actor and spectator, then in one body, we had this move possible between being a spectator of yourself and being an actor without thinking. Okay, this is why it becomes the phenomenological experiment. I know I'm being shallow. I have to apologize to people who are already, engaged in kind of thinking. But this is why that's the kind of research that is driving research program, which is driving some of this work. Okay, so we're building technologies that allow us to heat experientially the environment, like boiling water, like heating up, so that we can actually be on this razor edge between experience, which is immersive, experience, which is reflective. Okay, so it is, you could say, a proto-theater. A proto-theater. It's before theater, before narrative, so that when we have such a space available to people, we can walk in and people can create theater within such a space. Okay, that's the beginning of a conversation. Question? Please, Josh.
And you mentioned also ritual. You mentioned also ritual as part of a way of talking about the way that people experience those spaces. And I was wondering if there's any sense of repetition or learning or growth into ritual in that experience, either by the space or by the participants over a long period of time.
Yes. I'm sorry, was it Professor Bogdadia? I'm sorry, Rajiv, was that his name? He should have been here. There you are. Good. Thank you. Okay. We should now, this is a wonderful question. It allows me to make more of a reply, a better response to you. Okay. Thank you. Ritual. Okay. This kind of room, it's a magic room. People walk in, there's no user manual, there are no icons on the floor, push here. How do they know what to do, right? So part of this is accident. You move across the floor, you begin to hear, see, I hear this. Okay, so I've had sandpaper on my feet, I hear a different kind of sound. And then they begin to play. Some clowns can do this, right? Kids will do this. So if people can repeat, then begin to play this kind of thing. That's one way, but it's slow. Right? If you look at neural networks, it takes a long time to train a neural network. People are better, but still, it's slow. However, we're not, unlike VR systems, okay, we are not trying to replace the world. We're trying to use the world in all its density. We're using fabrics, we're using flesh, we're using props like chairs, okay, and we're using digital media. Now, in such a space, it's not a closed system. Just like Maturana Valera said, there are no closed systems, right? So because there's no closed system, people bring in memories. They bring in their personal memories, but they also bring in disciplines. That is, if I go in as a violinist, I go in with a discipline of 500 years of performance practice of playing the violin. Even take the instrument away from me. If I have a sense of rhythm, I have a sense of harmonic structures. Maybe it's inarticulate, but I have a sense. Okay, so that's a kind of a historical repetition. I'm bringing in a discipline with me of knowing how to respond to sound. And this is not just pure fluff. I mean, we're working with a group called Champ-Tassion, which is a chamber orchestra in Amsterdam, I believe. And they're musicians who perform without the instruments. So kind of a historic, that we're going to invite them into the space to play our space without instruments. And then we're going to have people come in who are off the street, also playing the space, and they will be entrained. So they look around and see what is everybody else doing. And then we'll imitate. So if you hear other people maybe clustering around to see how they respond to space, the newcomers, the newbies will come in and they'll also play along. Okay? This is another kind of repetition. It's by resonance rather than by copy. Okay? And then ritual, back to ritual. Some of the people who came to this space, they actually created what I think of as Proto Rituals. There was a pair of Koreans who came in, and the woman started to swing her arms in rotation like this, and she came up and grabbed her partner without doing too much and said, just move your arms together like this. And she began to move in ways that if you look at the video, I think many people say it's very ritualistic. And clearly, it seemed like it was based on folk dance methods from Korea. And I don't know what she was. I never had a chance to talk with her. So I am interested in this kind of space where you can raise the phenomenological level so that people can also not just invent from nothing, but actually vary from ritual patterns of behavior. Yes, but not artificially. We're not interested in making fake rituals. No. We don't pretend to do that. Yeah. Please, questions?